It's as close to an NFL stadium. It's quite an experience.
As we say in Aggieland, howdy. All right, you guys learned that already. On behalf of Mark Welsh, the Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service, I'd like to welcome everyone here to Aggieland. My name is Frank Ashley, and I'm the Senior Associate Dean for the Bush School of Government and Public Service. It's an honor to introduce the members of our distinguished panel, and you have their bios in your program, so I'm going to try to be very brief here. But one thing that we did mention in the back, these individuals on the stage need to be your best friend because they know where the money is. So keep that in mind. Our moderator is Dr. David Ellis, Senior Research Scientist at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. He has 35 years of service in transportation, economics, and finance, the economic impacts of infrastructure investment, tax policy, demographics, and government relations. He's been invited frequently to brief policymakers on transportation-related issues and has consulted on multiple occasions with transportation officials in China, India, and Brazil. Prior to returning to work to TTI, he worked in Austin as a lobbyist representing a number of clients in the construction materials industry before the Texas legislature. Dr. Ellis. And now our panel, starting from my far left, Mr. Frank Little is Executive Vice President of 3M Safety and Graphics Business Group. The group includes the company's Transportation Safety Division, producer of traffic safety infrastructure materials for signs, road markings, and temporary traffic control devices, and vehicle registration and safety solutions. His leadership team at 3M includes individuals who are active on the U.S. Department of Transportation's Advisory Committee on Automation and Transportation, the Texas Transportation Institute's Advisory Council, and the Executive Committee of the American Highway Users Alliance. Prior to his current role, he was Vice President and General Manager of 3M's Personal Safety Division and Managing Director of 3M Korea. That's Frank Little. Mr. Adrian Pellin is a Senior Vice President at Marsh, specializes in risk and insurance matters related to the infrastructure industry. He's responsible for ensuring that Marsh delivers its world-class risk advisory and strategic services to developers and contractors pursuing new infrastructure projects. He brings nearly 10 years of construction and infrastructure experience to the role, having worked on over 35 public-private partnerships in Canada and the United States. In 2013, 2014, and 2016, he was named as a power broker by Risk and Insurance. That's Mr. Adrian Pellin. Mr. Thomas Kelly serves as Executive Director with Floral's Project Development and Investment Group. His group has responsibility for structuring and executing project financings and equity investments for select opportunities in North America. Throughout his career, he's worked on the financing, design, construction, supervision, and contract oversight of multi-million-dollar highway, rail, port, parking, tunnel, and bridge projects, including the I-595 managed lanes, the Port of Miami Tunnel, Windsor-Essex Parkway, and 95 express lanes. That's Mr. Thomas Kelly. Mr. Darrell Davis serves as Executive Director with Morgan Stanley, and he leads Morgan Stanley's public finance efforts in non-traditional transportation finance and surface transportation. He recently joined Morgan Stanley after spending 3 years at the International Finance Corporation, a member of the World Bank Group. There he provided P3-related financial and transaction advisory services to governments in the Caribbean, executing transactions with the private sector. Prior to the IFC, he was a transportation specialist in Morgan Stanley's Public Finance Department for 9 years, and he's executed various types of bonding finances for major transportation issuers throughout the country. That's Mr. Darrell Davis. And last but not least, the Honorable Bill Poole. And I told him earlier that he and I have two things in common. We're both born in Louisiana. We both have 2 degrees from Alabama. Heard somebody else scream Roll Tide earlier. On November 2nd, 2010, Representative Poole was elected to the Alabama State House of Representatives to represent District 63, which includes the University of Alabama, much of the city of Tuscaloosa, and portions of the Tuscaloosa City and Tuscaloosa County school districts. He was born in New Orleans and raised in the rural town of Dayton, Alabama. After graduating from the University of Alabama, he worked for 4 years in Washington, D.C., and later returned to the University of Alabama to earn his law degree. He's practiced as an attorney in Tuscaloosa since 2004, and after his first legislative session in 2001, he was identified by veteran lawmakers as the top member of the 35 new lawmakers in the State House of Representatives. And in 2013, he was appointed as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which oversees all education appropriations for the state of Alabama, the Honorable Bill Poole. And that's your distinguished panel. Thank you.
All right, I'm David Ellis, and I'm pretty sure, despite what Frank said, we were asked to come up here and talk about funding, so I think we have been identified. We're the group that nobody likes because we have to talk about the hardest topic. One of the things, however, I kind of want to frame this debate just a little bit if I can. Mentioned earlier today, the American Society of Civil Engineers talked about a $2 trillion 10-year funding gap in the United States. That's in current dollars. By the time you count in inflation, it's somewhere probably between $2.5 and $3 trillion. Now, I don't exactly know how much $3 trillion of anything is, but I'm pretty sure it's approximately a lot. And so it's a big issue, a big problem, and it's one that's unlikely to be solved by the traditional funding mechanisms. Probably not going to be sufficient to address that problem. What about private capital? Public-private partnerships. Well, private capital is available, but it's not equally suitable for all projects. One of the other potential solutions is technology. And whether we're talking about fully autonomous vehicles or intelligent transportation systems, smart infrastructure, et cetera, that alone is probably not going to solve the problem either. As John Barton mentioned, I think in the very opening of this symposium, there's no single silver bullet. And there ain't no infrastructure fairy either. So it's probably going to take some combination of all of those things in order to address this particular issue that is vitally important to our economy. So we want to start off kind of on the traditional end of things. And one person on this stage who has actually tried to take on a traditional approach is Representative Bill Poole from Alabama. Now, he introduced a gasoline tax bill in Alabama, fought a lot of different groups. I shouldn't say fought, had to buy in a lot of different people, if you will, to get them as part of the process. And I was kidding him last night, telling him that he's, after introducing that tax bill, he's over here in Texas in a witness protection program. But that's not actually true. Again, introduced a tax bill and is living proof that you can get through and emerge alive. But talk a little bit about, Bill, if you will, about kind of the discourse there in Alabama as you went through this process.
Well, I did wonder if I'd have to end up in a protection program. You know, as all of you are aware, might imagine, Alabama is a very red state, a relatively poor state, and is very tax averse. But it's clear in Alabama, like so many states, we have major challenges and issues as it relates to the infrastructure needs across our state, both urban and rural, and we have a large and significant port in Mobile, and all of our infrastructure systems are aging, and of course that's the common theme while we're all here. I chair an appropriations committee that oversees education appropriations, but through the course of that and through the course of needing to see our economy grow in Alabama and trying to determine how we can accomplish that, ultimately led me straight into the infrastructure debate. So I agreed to enter a discussion with a number of the stakeholders across the state who had not come into an agreement at the time in terms of a model to fund transportation infrastructure and increase revenue. But they asked me to come in and would I assist them and see if we could establish a framework to move forward with legislation. Ultimately, we did identify a framework which was effectively a traditional cents per gallon funding increase on a gasoline tax. Personally, if I were in a vacuum, I think I would have addressed it a number of different ways, but ultimately that was the only model that we felt we could get all of the needed stakeholders to the table, message a simple message out to the public, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and have our best chance of passage through a very skeptical legislature. We ultimately came very close. I believe we had the votes in both chambers, but we had some procedural hurdles we didn't quite make it over. But I think we substantially, at least in Alabama, changed the narrative and changed the discussion and advanced the issue significantly, such that the conversation in Alabama now is, what are we going to do? It's not, do we have a problem, or how are we going to fix it? It's, we recognize we have a problem. How are we going to fund the necessary improvements? And of course, the numbers are so staggering, it'll take a multi-year approach across multiple levels. But what I found in terms of, I think, some of the comments today was, you really have to convince a skeptical public of why they need to support that tax increase. And a couple of the previous speakers have talked about the public buy-in. And that's obviously step number one when you're talking about public funds. And step 1A in that process, in my opinion, and I think we were attempting to do this, but we didn't have the lead time to effectively establish a plan because we had a window of opportunity that kind of just jumped right in front of us, and we tried to move the legislation through that window while it lasted, and I think it still does at this point, however, is convincing the skeptical public as to what is your vision. And we've talked about the lack of vision in terms of what do we need, where do we need to go in infrastructure nationally, but we really lack that right now in Alabama. Is what is our infrastructure plan? How are we going to fund it? What are the opportunity costs if we fail to fund it? And what are the return on that investment if we do fund it? And it's hard to talk about nationally. It's fairly easy to talk about locally, but it's hard to talk about statewide too, because as many of you are aware, the discussion instantly fragments into rural and urban, into poverty areas and more affluent areas, into farmers and the business community, and into so many different fragmented perspectives that you have to articulate how that vision and how that plan is going to impact all of those positively. And messaging out to a skeptical public is very difficult. And you know, a dynamic we have in Alabama, I think in a lot of places, is everybody's so angry at the federal government, they don't care about state government. The answer to everything in terms of government is going to be instantly no, unless you can convince and establish an alternative means for doing that. And I think part of that too is providing options and costs. So we had a plan, we had a package. We struggled to really have a real tight message in terms of economic impact. Where would projects go? How would they be prioritized? How would funding be divided? Would we bond it? Would we not? And those were some of the loose ends that we were wrapping up as we went, but really caused some issues as we tried to advance. But our governor stepped forward and expressed support for infrastructure funding and continues to. So, you know, I think part of the takeaway on that is, though, we did move the needle in terms of public perception, I believe, and perception in the legislature. So I think it can be done. It's not an easy task. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of coordination, and it's a narrow path. One stakeholder can break loose and bring down an issue very quickly in the state legislature before anybody really knows what has happened. But I think we had a positive experience. I had very little negative blowback. I had a few funny nights right before we decided ultimately everybody signed off and I was going to introduce the bill, thinking, how did I get myself into this position? But it really worked out positively. I had one negative email, very little negative communications back, and I think many of the legislators in Alabama experienced that same kind of, we really didn't have that big anti-tax blowback we anticipated, and I think that's going to potentially position us well to address these issues, but those educational components are critical. You
talk about education and messaging. if you take that to the private sector, I think there's a lot of different potential ways to do things using private money. And I wanted to get Tom Kelly just here at the beginning of our discussion to kind of talk about some of the different ways and that private sector funds can be used in infrastructure investment to help generate the kind of infrastructure this country is going to need.
Sure. Thanks, David, and thanks to Texas A&M for having me here. I am not a Texan, but I had the good sense to marry a Houstonian, and as my wife puts it, I'm a much better Texan than she'll ever be. But in any event, yeah, actually, I'd like to get a little audience participation on a quick question. When those in the audience, okay, and this is just a quick show of hands, okay, when you think of a public-private partnership or a P3, is by show of hands, is your first thought a toll road? Okay, I expected a little bit higher number, because the perception, you know, a lot of times that we at Floor see is when we talk about P3s is, well, okay, it's just another toll road. You want to privatize it. You want to get the private sector to take the revenue off the top. And admittedly, that is one of the mechanisms that we quite often use, and one of the mechanisms that a lot of DOTs use. I think part of that is because in the nascent U.S. P3 market, a lot of the first deals were done with toll revenue, right? Chicago Skyway, Indiana Toll Road, TxDOT had an enormously successful, well, depending on which side of the coin you're on, series of toll roads procured, okay? Under that mechanism, the concessionaire, which is a consortium of private entities, steps in, provides an upfront payment to the authority. They may build out additional capacity or build brand new capacity. And for that initial investment, and for perhaps even a contribution to the state, they're able to derive the toll revenues. Okay, that's the P3 that everybody knows and loves. For better or for worse, the U.S. market developed that way. And I personally think that sometimes that was a bit of a detriment, because just like a lot of you have probably experienced in your local municipalities, there's sometimes a resistance to tolls. And there can be especially a resistance to a private entity stepping in and tolling and being perceived as taking over the crown jewels. That becomes even more complicated when it may be a foreign investor that's doing so. Yeah. So there's a little bit of a political and public knee-jerk reaction to that. But the other mechanism, which actually, quite frankly, I would suggest is more prominent in the U.S., it's more prominent in Canada, and in the European countries where P3 is still common, is the availability payment structure. And under that mechanism, the DOT or the public authority isn't necessarily going to be receiving an upfront payment, okay? What they get is a risk transfer to the private sector, right? So the private sector, the consortium comes in, they build out the asset, so it's a design, build, finance, operate, maintain, okay? They build out the asset, okay? They have to, and provided that they build and then operate and maintain the asset over, say 30, 35 years according to a very strict set of specs, they receive a steady payment from the public sector, okay? Now you would ask, why what's the benefit there? Well, for one, sometimes you can apply the P3 model to an asset that doesn't necessarily wash its own face, as we would say. So it doesn't generate revenue. You can't put a toll revenue on let's say, most transit, for example, would be a good example, okay? But at the heart of the value there is that you are transferring risk to the private sector, okay? And you're asking that private sector to really take over ownership of the asset, right? We often talk about a holistic approach towards our bids, right? So we, as a design build entity and as the entity that's going to operate the asset over the long term, we design it and we build it for the long term, okay? Contrast that with more traditional methods, right? Where the design or the contractor, the EPC contractor, is engaged to build the asset. They enter into a competitive procurement whereby the lowest bidder wins, and they are incentivized to build the asset the most cheaply that they can. That may not necessarily be the most inexpensive or the most efficient way to do it over the long term. Now, you contrast that a situation where you're asked to bid and you're evaluated over the net present value of cost to the public authority. And I guarantee you, because I've sat in these discussions, you look at it from the entire life of the asset, okay? So that's it. We thought that would be a good primer and a good kickoff for broader discussion.
Good. We talked about traditional funding mechanisms, a little bit sort of the landscape of different ways to use private capital. And the other thing I mentioned at the outset was technologies, and I want to call on Frank Little at 3M here in just a second to talk about that. But before I do, I will tell you that after Frank kind of talks a little bit about technology, we'll come back to Daryl and to Adrian and talk a little bit about risk and then about impediments. And then we want to kind of turn this into a freewheeling discussion, and we'll have microphones going around, and feel free to, at any point, interject with a question or a comment. So, but Frank, I want to talk a little bit about technology, and one of which is that 3M is fundamentally a materials company. And as we look at infrastructure investment, what role can new materials play in getting better value for the buck for the public?
Yeah. Well, thank you, David. And first, thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. It was ironic when you mentioned these are the guys that have the money. I don't view it we're the guys that have the money. We're the guys that maybe can help spend the money more wisely with some of the choices around technology. And I'd like to try to maybe address that a little bit. I think if you think about new materials and the technology impact that can have on roadways, whether it's the roadways of today and the kind of traffic flow patterns and logistics that we're trying to provide today, or even in the future in automated senses, there are different types of technology that can come to bear. You can think about technologies that impact the surface, or the durability, or the quality, or the friction, or other things of that nature. And there are all sorts of types of technologies that can be incorporated to modify the characteristics of the concrete, the hardness, the resiliency of it in some ways. Or you can think about some of the ways you can incorporate more sustainable materials into that, and either into the asphalt or the concrete mix that goes into that. And I think that's some things to consider when you're considering the longevity of the investment you're making and how that plays out over time. The second one I would say is if you think about the sustainability. Sometimes the materials that you can think about, or there's some new classes of materials that can replace some of the existing materials, some natural pozzolanic materials, for example, that can replace potash, which is primarily produced by coal-fired production. And there's ways of incorporating different materials that have similar properties to also increase the capability of the mix that you're using in the aggregate at that point in time. You can think about the investment in safety and what you can do in terms of improving the safety of the roads and thus the efficiency of the roads. We talk about efficient investment and spending our capital wisely. There was a study done at TTI years ago that talked about, a third of the non-recurring congestion in the roadways is due to traffic accidents and incidents, and a quarter of the entire congestion is due to that. Think about ways you can incorporate safety into the design to prevent those sort of things. And maybe that would allow the infrastructure to be able to handle traffic better, last a longer time, be more efficient, and thus get more bang for your buck in the investment. And then the last way I would say that is if you think about the future of roadways and you think about automated vehicles and where things are going, I think there's a real consideration that needs to be made today for what types of technology are being invested in the roadways. And I think it's going to be a long time where we're going to see both conventional driving on the roads as well as automated driving on the roads and some mix thereof for some period of time. And you have to think about the ability of that to coexist together and how it operates and how it's interoperable. And there's some materials technology, some of what we were demonstrating at the noon hour today, that's related to how you would enable vehicles to see the safety infrastructure on the roadway as good as a human can. and thus make the right kind of calls and judgments of how you guide vehicles. So I think all that leads to kind of the longer term view, as Tom was pointing out, about what you're really trying to get out of your infrastructure investment, how efficient it can be, how long it can last, and how maintainable it is over time.
Super. Adrian, I wanted to ask you, because Tom mentioned this, brought it up, and I know this is kind of in your bailiwick, talked about risk, transferring risk to the private sector. Yeah, and this whole public-private partnership concept, while 30-plus states have that enabling legislation, it's still relatively new to the United States in a lot of ways, done elsewhere in the world on a much more frequent basis. So kind of help us understand what you're talking about when you say risk and how it gets transferred to the private sector, and how that calculates into the ability to provide capital for roadways or any kind of infrastructure.
Absolutely, thank you, and thank you again for having me today. I think what Tom mentioned, it's all about value for money, and that's really kind of the whole crux of it. I come from the land of the North, Canada, and public-private partnerships are widely utilized there, certainly not for all forms of infrastructure. And during my time there, I often represented public entities, Infrastructure Ontario being one of the most prominent ones. And my role was to really help them evaluate risk and to figure out commercially what we can put to the private sector, and particularly in my role as a risk and insurance advisor, what could be transferred to third parties. Now, since I've been in the U.S. for nearly 10 years now, spent a great deal of time working with folks like Tom, supporting them in their pursuits of these types of projects. And I think what's important when it comes from a risk perspective is understanding all the aspects that go into it. So certainly there's design and construction, of course, which is no different from a design-build perspective, but we also have obviously life cycle risks. But more than that, I think we're seeing a significant transfer of other risks that I would say the private sector historically hasn't necessarily had to manage, but now they are, and this is where I would say there's a lot of value from the public sector perspective in utilizing P3, and it doesn't necessarily have to be full board design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. Could be some iteration of that, and there's certainly many permutations. One big one is certainly performance and the coordination of design, construction, operation, and maintenance. A big one that I've had to face, particularly when we're looking at infrastructure in urban areas that are currently blighted and in disrepair, is many site condition exposures, geological risks, environmental risks, archaeological. I had a project most recently that was in a bit of a sensitive area in Quebec, no less, and they were doing highway reconstruction and found old tanneries from the 16th century. So just to give you an example of some of the issues that we're starting to deal with, and what the pressure comes to folks like me on is, well, again, this is not something it's pretty fortuitous. How do we transfer that? And that's when I have to work with a number of insurance companies, as well as, I would say, institutional investors who are now getting into the space and being willing to take on much more and more and greater levels of risk than they have before. And I think that's an opportunity to use that risk tolerance to deliver infrastructure. I think a couple of things we can think about just from the risk perspective a little bit further. The funding mechanisms we talked about, certainly in light of Irma and Harvey, obviously here, when we have private sector management of these assets, that can be a big catastrophe to think about, flood and windstorm and surge. There's been, I think, a key component to a lot of these projects is equitable risk transfer as well. I know in Anthus here, I worked on a few of the FDOT projects from a risk perspective. All the agreements, or many of them, are public. Certainly equitable risk transfer in those environments where, particularly when you have high windstorm exposed areas, they're so catastrophic that we can't necessarily get the interest to take on that type of exposure. There's a risk sharing mechanism in place, whether it's capped or co-sharing arrangements. So there are a lot of tools and arrangements that can be put in place between, I would say, the private sector, public sector, as well as third-party companies like insurance companies to take on a lot more risk. We're also seeing an emergence of new products, going back to the funding component. Performance security is a big one, and I think one of the constant arguments we see in the U.S. and not so much in Canada is cost of capital and having access to tax-exempt debt. And of course, the private sector can't have access to funding at that level. A lot of these P3 projects, they have to obviously get a number of different financing packages, and certainly Tom can speak to this more than I can, having direct experience in it. putting in equity, let's say 10 to 20%. The rest is loan or debt financing, often sold to institutional investors. That debt needs to get rated. There are a number of tools in place to help credit enhance the debt rating so that we get more favorable terms to hopefully lower the cost of capital. Alternatively, looking at the public perspective, municipalities, I have a number of friends, and maybe Daryl can even speak to this from his experience, looking at bond finance, and it's harder for municipalities that are much smaller to get financing for infrastructure projects. So there are even municipal bond insurance products out there to help offload that exposure and to increase the rating. Just one other thing I wanted to mention before I turn it back over to David. Looking at models, and I came down from Canada and often spend still a lot of time up there working on, say, pure P3 projects. But there's a couple of new things emerging up there. There's been a development of a Canadian infrastructure bank that hasn't necessarily finalized its mandate. But one of the things it's looking at doing, rather than turning over the entire procurement to the private sector, is essentially to do the procurement themselves and bring in private sector capital and some level of project management to help run it. They're going to be using that entity, I think, to look more at higher risk projects in particular. Another one that we're seeing is the public-public model. I was just up in Montreal a couple of weeks ago, and CDPQ, which is a large institutional investor, manages probably 200 plus billion in funds, has an old infrastructure arm. And essentially what they're doing is acting as a liaison to the public authorities to essentially do all the planning, assessment up front themselves, arrange for the financing, propose a project. They're working on a very public project right now in Montreal. It's about a $6 billion light rail project. They've done all the economic studies themselves. They're going to the public sector with the idea and then running the procurements themselves for construction, rail car supply, and operations and maintenance separately. And again, the whole benefit is that's still benefiting the taxpayers because it's a public pension fund. So just another idea from a delivery method that can help with funding.
So we've heard a lot of different potential ideas. Daryl, you get maybe the harder question, and that is, what are the impediments to getting this kind of work done? What changes are required in the public sector to help facilitate infrastructure improvements?
Sure, thanks, David. I think the size of the deficit we're facing, I think a lot of what conversation I'm hearing here, you're going to hear, repeated through me as well. But, whether it's technology or P3s or tax-exempt bonds, those things help deliver, I think, the incremental project, but will in no way attack that large deficit that we're seeing. What that requires, and what I think of when you say funding, is revenues. So, what Representative Poole championed in terms of getting, higher gas taxes for the state of Alabama, that's exactly what's needed to get these projects off the ground, to get more into that deficit of infrastructure that we're facing. The financing aspect of it is a function of the revenues. If there are more revenues, you can bring forward more projects in time. Financing really is just an NPV analysis, right? So I think a discussion around higher revenues, a discussion around paying for assets, a discussion around the benefits of improved infrastructure will help to bring these projects to fruition. I think the other conversation that needs to happen is just as some of my colleagues here have already sort of alluded to, is just a broader acceptance of the private sector involvement in project delivery. Doesn't necessarily have to be a full-blown concession, but in New York, for example, there's no design-build law. Well, design-build in and of itself, delivers an efficiency that can get projects done better. So whether it's a design-build approach or a design-build finance, just getting the private sector involved more in project delivery, that's a conversation that also needs to happen, and sort of allay public concerns and public perceptions about the private sector raiding public assets.
So how do we get from here to there? I mean, it seems like it's not necessarily a lack of viable solutions. I mean, I keep hearing that there's plenty of private capital out there available under the right conditions for the right projects, the right circumstances, et cetera. Representative Poole was talking about the willingness of, it didn't get a lot of blowback in terms of raising public funding for infrastructure, and a lot of polls, you see, people want additional infrastructure investment. They want better commutes, better commute times, better roads, better transit, et cetera. Where is the disconnect? How did we mess this up? Okay, I mean, how do we get from where we are now to a structure that allows the United States to return to having one of the best infrastructure systems in the world? I know that's a large question, but that is the crux of the issue. How do we get from here to there? Anybody want to take that on?
I'll start. I'll do an opening salvo, but I think Representative Morrison this morning said that she was open to kind of every tool in the toolbox. And quite frankly, I think that's kind of the approach that needs to be taken. That's not a clean answer, I know. That's not a panacea for what ails us, but I think that's it. And when we look at the power sector, right? It's an analogous problem, right? Is the future all renewables? No. Is it gas fired? No. Is it nuclear? No. It's probably all of the above. I wouldn't necessarily be as bold to put coal in there, but okay. But I think the same analogy can be said for infrastructure financing. Okay. Darrell mentioned. I mean, obviously, yes, we need to start with some form of revenue. Okay. If I was on the, let's say, the opposite side, if I wasn't on the private side, if I was on the public side, and I was within a DOT, I would say, okay, what are the resources I have available? I have my tax revenue to some extent. Okay. I have a pool of assets, potentially, that may be revenue generating. And maybe there are regulatory policy limitations as to what I can do. But can I monetize some of those assets and turn the payments that I receive for monetizing a highway, right? Can I turn that over and expand, whether it's adjacent infrastructure or rural infrastructure? And you start to balance out your assets. The other thing that I would point to is consistency. I think we were all kind of reminiscing over the challenges that we faced at one point or the other with procurements that blow up, right? A public procuring authority decides to dip their toe into P3 and kind of to test the waters. They enter into a full-blown procurement, only to find out that it wasn't the solution that they were looking for, and they revert, and they go design, build. That can obviously damper, private sector interest, right? It can make your next project to come along even more challenging. So I think consistency is a key item.
Anybody else?
David, maybe I just get back to your question. How did we get here? I think it's two things. One is, I don't like paying taxes just as much as the next guy. But when you look at, on the federal level, the federal gas taxes haven't been increased in, since 1993, right? That is just a recipe for disaster. And combine that with the fact that I see, and this I'm drawing more broadly on my experience with the IFC in the Caribbean as well, but around the world where governments typically fall down in terms of infrastructure is long-term maintenance. So that part of the life cycle of an infrastructure asset can be much better managed by the private sector. And I think, when you look at projects like, when you look at, for example, I come from New York, and you look at the subway system in New York, it's nothing but deferred maintenance. Well, there's got to be a solution where you can bring the private sector in to help with that deferred maintenance to deliver a better subway system. And to your point, Tom, I don't think there's one solution here. It's going to be a mix of, like you said, I have this portfolio of assets. This I can do myself. These things I can't do, and this is another bucket over here. And it's a mix of solutions or a mix of approaches to attack the problem.
Anybody else? Frank?
Yeah, David, not so much from the finance side, but I will echo some of the comments. I think it has to be a blend of a lot of things, as everybody's pointed out, and nothing revolutionary there, except that I think when we think about the blend of things, It's a blend of different types of funding mechanisms. It's a blend of making use taxes really applicable to the use of the roads in some way and finding ways to do that, even in a changing environment. We have to anticipate where the environment's going and making sure that we think about that as we think about how you create usage taxes. At the same time, so much of the dollars today are going just to maintain the roads we are. Any solutions we can provide that help maintain those roads more efficiently, I think are going to have lasting benefits and are part of the solution, not the solution, but part of the solution. And then the third element I'd say is just, you know, Tom spoke about consistency. I'll take it in a little bit different path. I think today the adoption of new technologies, it might have a benefit. It gets complex. There's long adoption cycle. There's a lot of fragmentation in the regulatory framework, and even from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, where you have to prove out new technologies from one to the other on a very, very small scale. And I think efforts that can kind of pull some of that together might enable more efficient solutions to be adopted more quickly.
I wanted to ask, going back to, and maybe Bill, maybe one for you to take on first, going back to a traditional solution like an increase in the gasoline tax. When we're looking at greater and greater increases in fuel efficiency, higher market penetration of alternative fuel vehicles or hybrid vehicles, the gas tax as a long-term viable solution to providing some sort of a reliable stream of revenue, you know, is slowly but surely, and in many instances not so much slowly anymore, is going away. Mm-hmm. From a public policy point of view, where do we go from here?
Well, I think that's an excellent point. It's kind of been alluded to a couple times today, but not addressed directly, and it's bothered me with respect to my support of increasing that gasoline tax as a revenue model, because it's a structurally flawed model. And I think we all know that we're going to cross a line, and we're really crossing that line and on the downslope now, but increasing gasoline revenues by 10 cents a gallon, for instance, really is only going to be a short-term solution, because we know we're going to continue to have diminished returns on that. So, you know, I perceive this as we're closing a gap for a period of time until technology, until the disruptive forces that I think are ahead of us begin to present more clearly, so that we can research and study and find those alternative solutions, because the traditional model of taxing a gallon of gasoline is not going to be sustainable for the same reasons it's not sustainable today. And I think, though, as we have this discussion and we address the point that there are going to have to be multiple components of this, you know, it sounds cliché, and we go back to it time and time again, but having the public buy-in, having the public understand that they can no longer just take for granted that infrastructure is going to be there. I think we built our infrastructure system up and then all of a sudden just take it for granted. And that the federal government's not going to swoop in and be the white knight with all the money. We've got to bridge a gap here, I think, while we find all of the alternative solutions and patch that and stitch that together very creatively to find a more sustainable model for the future.
You know, one of the things in my conversations with legislators here in Texas about gasoline tax and that sort of thing, and a couple of years ago, I had a member of the legislature tell me, you know, David, I don't want to die on that hill because it's not going to be a real solution to begin with, because we're just going to keep losing revenue. So you're asking me to vote for a tax increase that's really not going to solve a problem. And so I think there is a component of that in there in terms of resistance. But Frank, when we start talking about technology, I want to go back to that just a little bit. I mean, we've talked here about funding and financing infrastructure. What is the danger that we build a 20th century infrastructure for a 21st century economy? How much risk is there in that?
That's a great question. I wish I had the crystal ball that would answer that entirely. I don't think anybody does. I think there's a tremendous amount of interest I won't go so far as call it hype, but there's a tremendous amount of interest in alternative ways of transporting people and things other places. I think we are in a stage today where, probably less will happen in the next 5 years than people hope, and more will happen in the next 20 than people think. And we're just in that part of the adoption cycle of that's very, very, very difficult. I think there are things we can do working together, though, to identify, what are the vectors that will need to be addressed as we think about new infrastructure, and what can we anticipate pretty reliably? Maybe not everything, but what can we anticipate that gives us the best chance of success in terms of how do we enable, these different modes of transportation, be it surface transportation by vehicles, whether it be on the rail network or other networks, that would allow us to have systems that could work in that environment, but at the same time be interoperable with the systems of today. And I think that's the key word, the interoperability, where you build an infrastructure where you have the capability for human interaction on that infrastructure, as well as machine interaction on that infrastructure, becomes really, really critical. And you have to think about those interfaces and that interoperability going forward. And that argues to me for a little bit more coordination of our effort in terms of defining what are the parameters that has to address. And I think we're seeing some more activity on that, but I think there is more work that's really needed in the near term on that.
Yes, go ahead, Adrian.
I think fundamentally when you think about infrastructure, going back to economics, David, it's a tragedy of the commons, and everyone wants to use it but doesn't necessarily want to pay for it. Mm-hmm. And going back to technology, I think it's really, as you mentioned, a coordinated approach. Really requires multidisciplinary engagement, whether it's from academia, government, certainly private sector players, mm-hmm. Particularly because of this now increasing risk of things being obsolete. And, I'm sure I'll be talking to my kids, maybe in a hovercraft, in 20 or 30 years, or maybe not. But, looking at autonomous vehicles, autonomous trucking, I think there's significant disruption opportunities right there. And it impacts things much broader than infrastructure. Jobs as well, and how are these people going to be employed going forward? So it's really multidisciplinary issue at the end of the day.
But for the finance guys, does this uncertainty, the fact that we don't know, and the fact that we're talking about long-term capital assets, and not knowing exactly what the demand is going to be, because we're not sure exactly what kind of technologies are going to be ultimately adopted, does that cause the finance industry some pause in terms of, are we financing the right infrastructure?
Well, it's right down Adrian's court, but it does highlight potential risk for sure, right? At the end of the day, these concessions are 30 to 50 years in length, and when you sign, you're committing to operate and maintain that asset, and there's typically nice provisions in that contract that say kind of, you're obligated to maintain and keep it kind of on par with other assets of its kind, more or less, right? Which would require some technology upgrades. How do you price that? So Fluor, not only do we design, build it, but we'll operate and maintain it. And so, and when we execute the contract, we're basically providing 30 to 35 years of fixed price on the O&M. How do you price that technology risk? So yeah, there is a concern. It's always something that we would like our public sector partner to agree to kind of a periodic sit down and let's look at this, because that can work both ways, right? Let's see, make sure that we're truly addressing what we need to from a technology perspective. But yeah, absolutely, it's a risk. Now on the other side, and this is it's hearsay, and I won't name names, but there was a highway, a toll road in Virginia that we recently bid on, and Fluor actually decided to drop out of the competition because we didn't think toll revenues were necessarily sufficient. The winning bidder, okay, so normally when in a lot of toll roads, your revenue would, might see an uptick, in the first 5 years as people get used to the asset, and then it's a steady growth, right? Kind of grows with inflation. market rumors are that this bidder's profile has that uptick. It's kind of steady state growth for a few years, and then at a certain period of time in the future, it takes another uptick. And the speculation is that that is automation, that they're anticipating that those hot lanes are going to be available for automated vehicles only, and instead of having this much clearance between bumper to bumper, you'll be able to ride those cars, you know. So there's risk, but I think there's also opportunity at this pace because, you know, that particular bidder put a several $100 million bet on that technology improving their situation. So risk reward.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I would just add, I think a concession agreement it's an incomplete contract, and seeing 50 years into the future is just impossible, right? So to a certain degree, investors need to take that leap, that extra, uptick in revenues will occur, but they're willing to take it, right? Equity investors are willing to take that risk because that's what they have appetite for. The bond markets are completely wide open for infrastructure financing right now. Whether it's private activity bonds, regular tax-exempt bonds, funded against gas taxes. Investors right now want exposure to the U.S. despite the fact that the future is uncertain. And this is what they do, risk versus return. Mm-hmm. So at this juncture, there's a tremendous amount of investor interest in the U.S. From both the debt markets and the private equity markets.
So where is the disconnect? And I asked that in this context. I mean, you talked about this just a little bit ago, touched on it. But let me ask it in a different way. To the general public out there, who are out there living their lives and driving from here to there, they want to drive on good roads and they don't want to spend excess time in traffic congestion. They expect that. That's what they want. We have tools to deliver that. I mean, whether it's traditional public financing mechanisms, gasoline tax, vehicle registration fees, whatever. We've got capital available for projects that would work. It seems like to me that we apparently have done an incredibly poor job in terms of providing any kind of vision. And when I say we, I don't mean you guys in particular and those industry sectors in particular, but I mean the public and those who are involved in transportation, in providing any kind of vision, any kind of leadership, any kind of reason in a lot of ways for people to understand a lot of these solutions. It seems like we've done a poor job of communicating. How do we get over that hurdle? What do we do? Anybody want to jump into that swamp?
I'll take a quick step. I mean,
all right.
I think from the public-private partnership perspective, I think we need to change how we talk about public-private partnerships with the public owners of these assets, with your constituents. I think saying the words privatization, that's just wrong. In many of these P3s, the title to the assets remains with the government owner. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to change how we talk about P3s. Around risk transfer. A concession agreement is a risk-sharing mechanism. So I think getting the public to understand that this asset will be operated by the private sector, maintained by the private sector entirely, in exchange for an availability payment. That's a conversation that needs to happen. And sort of getting into a little bit of the guts of a concession agreement needs to be, that needs to come out in public discourse. Penalties that are associated with non-performance under a concession agreement, that needs to be discussed with the public.
I know, and I'll use the Texas example that I'm a little bit familiar with. Texas A&M Transportation Institute does transportation poll every other year, and one of those questions in that poll is, would you support a gasoline tax to increase funding for transportation? And no. Do you know what the gasoline tax is? Most people, the overwhelming majority of people, did not know what the gasoline tax was and didn't know whether it was a nickel, 2 cents, 20 cents, 50 cents, or whatever, or whether it was priced on a per gallon basis or based on the price, just opposed to taxes in general. How do we demonstrate, or do we have to, instead of loading the question, do we have to do a better job of demonstrating the return on the transportation investment that the public is making? And if so, how?
Well, I for one think you do, because that's how you sell. And I think you got to bring it back to the bare bones basics, which is it's about jobs, it's about our economy, it's about our competitiveness on the global level, and it's about growing our GDP relative to our competitors globally. And I think we need a national leader. We need a national voice that can go out and make that case, because it's been said over and over, even today, it's not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. We've got to make the case that it's an economic issue and our future prosperity depends on it. And I think we enjoy our current prosperity by virtue of the infrastructure that this country built out a number of decades ago, and then we stopped. And our competition globally, I can isolate the competition down to the state level. I think the state of Alabama is losing. We are losing our competition with our sister states just in the southeast. I'm making that argument in Alabama, and I think I'm prevailing on it. But I think we've got to make that argument to the people and demonstrate that it's a return, but our future prosperity depends on it. And that, to me, is the bottom line.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I just agree with Bill on that and say I don't think there's a general grasp of the linkage between the investment in infrastructure and the overall economic benefit of it, and how it influences our economy, how it influences our competitiveness. You know, we serve the infrastructure industry globally, and I will tell you many leading edge things are not happening here that are happening in other places. And I think that recognition needs to be there, because fundamentally it is so integral to our economy and our competitiveness to have an efficient infrastructure. And I think it's just not, maybe we haven't done a good enough job of putting that on everybody's radar screen.
All right, I've got a question that I want to ask, but I want to remind you that we've got folks around here with microphones. So if you have a question, there's a gentleman right there. Go ahead and we'll take his question, and then I want to come back, and another lady right there. Yes, sir.
Bob Butler from AECOM. Just a quick question, picking up on the risk idea and thinking about some of the things that have happened and are continuing to happen at an increasing intensity. Think about the comments this morning about cyber attacks, thinking about Harvey and Irma, and thinking about how we've in the past used actuarial tables to kind of estimate risk. Cyber, we're still trying to figure it out. As we think about going forward, what are the panel's thoughts about how to take into account those types of risks coming from the environment as well as technology being used by others?
Gentlemen?
Happy to take a stab at that one. I mean, I think there's no crystal ball. I'd certainly like to say there is, but I think what's clear, you know, from my industry, people always look at historical trends. I mean, not putting cyber aside, but looking at storms. I mean, looking at the Houston area alone, I mean, we've had 100-year floods here recently, more than once in the last several years, obviously Irma. So it's becoming increasingly volatile. My hometown of Toronto has had flooding. I mean, I've never had a situation like that in my lifetime. So it's clear that it's becoming increasingly volatile. With that being said, there's so much capital in the insurance industry in particular to take on these risks that people are still crowding in. And we're seeing institutional investors pour more and more into the market. So right now, we're still at a critical mass such that cost remains relatively competitive, at least in the current state, even in light of Irma and Harvey. So I would say, you know, insurance costs, at least for what we can tell now, are relatively stable. I mean, that could certainly change. It did in 9/11, radically upset the market. But I just read some corporate research. We track globally insurance pricing trends, and we've had 19 consecutive quarters of declining property and casualty rates. Cyber risk, huge issue, and I certainly took note when Representative Ratcliffe mentioned earlier. It's something I've been spending a great deal of time researching and trying to educate myself on personally. There's a couple of aspects to this. One is really understand from an integrated perspective you know, how infrastructure going forward is going to be connected. I mean, obviously we have smart buildings. I was watching a video earlier this year on a company, Balfour Beatty, that talked about, you know, where infrastructure and construction is going to be in 2050, and they talked about individual components to our infrastructure having technology that will be able to order its own replacement parts. And when I think about that from a risk perspective, it's a lot of risk. I think about automated people movers, and, you know, especially in the current environment with terrorists, we don't only think about cyber attacks on data like we do with Equifax. It's how can we actually attack our infrastructure, and that presents a significant issue for our industry. I would say we are responding with new products, and there is capacity, but you're absolutely right. Until we have events, it's very hard to estimate what it's going to look like in the future.
Yes, ma'am.
It's okay? Oh, that's much better. All right. Barbara Minsker from SMU, and my area of work has been in stormwater infrastructure for a while now, and one of the things that people are really interested in is green stormwater infrastructure, where you bring green spaces in that can capture the water, help prevent flooding, water quality problems, but also if you can make greenways, you know, help with provide transportation pathways as well as recreation, health benefits, education, all kinds of benefits. The problem is that when you're looking at constructing green spaces in an urban environment, it's extra cost to a developer. It's extra cost to a property owner. The benefits that come from it are borne by different people than the ones that would have to bear the extra cost. So I'm thinking of, you know, there's been a lot of conversation about public-private partnerships in that kind of a context of how you would do that. I'm in Dallas, so all the green spaces right now are free in Dallas. And entry fees, well, you know, you want people to have access to green spaces, so entry fees would kick that up. Maybe it's entertainment that goes on in those areas, or it's concessions, or, you know, and then I'm just curious, have you seen models for that kind of an infrastructure that serves these multiple services, multiple purposes? How you would do that in a public-private partnership?
I personally, scanning the memory banks, but I haven't necessarily seen a model to, if I get the gist of your question, how to necessarily monetize or kind of share in the economics of providing green space. And I take your point because, you know, if Fluor were to be building something, you know, yes, providing the green space would be potentially an additional cost. So there is that kind of push and pull. What I have seen
wants to build out every square inch they can of an apartment building and not leave green space, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
What I will say is in the transportation space, I have seen us put forward solutions that have required a lot less taking of right-of-way. But the unfortunate reality is that usually that comes alongside toll lanes, because you know, there's a particular example in Virginia where we were meeting with VDOT, and we sat down with VDOT. VDOT had a plan to expand their Capital Beltway, and if anybody's driven around DC, they know how, you know, the Capital Beltway can be a nightmare. It still is today. And VDOT's plan was to just build out, I don't know how many X number of additional general purpose lanes. And it was going to take an enormous amount of right of way, including, you know, tens, if not 100 or more homes. And we came in with a solution that saved those homes, saved that right of way, but it did, part of the solution was to put hot lanes down there. So you know, and again, maybe the evil concessionaire, but for those willing to pay, you have access, you have reliability, you know, you have economics of time value, and it saved green. You know, well, if you can consider private residences green space, it saved green space. Certainly, in other bids that I've seen, you know, that's a requirement of the bidding that you know, in order to, you know, when you build it, you know, maybe a cut and cover tunnel is specified method of construction because, yes, is it Clyde Warren is a perfect example of that. And it's a beautiful park, it's a beautiful space, but I guess we just haven't cracked the nut yet as to how to motivate construction companies to provide that other than requiring it in the bid.
All right, one last question.
Brenda Mainwaring, Union Pacific Railroad. So most of the conversation this afternoon has been about a public infrastructure seeking private investment. We heard this morning a little bit about private projects, Amazon requiring public investment. There's a third piece of the story, a third leg of the stool, which is freight rail, where it's private infrastructure that clearly adds capacity to public infrastructure through taking freight off the road and freeing up roadways for more commuters. Basing those decisions the investment decisions in freight rail are made on return on investment. Those decisions don't calculate public benefit because there's no clear return on investment in a private infrastructure. And yet, Connect Oregon was probably the best example from the rail industry's perspective for a public project or a public program that calculated the public benefit and inserted dollars into a private investment in order to leverage the private investment for public benefit. Very complicated. Connect Oregon has now kind of backed off. I'd be interested in your perspectives on, because it really hasn't been discussed at all, how do you get to that third, somewhat more complicated component of a very a very specific P3, but it's unique in the kind of investment that has to be made?
And I would say that I think it's sort of, I think we're saying the same thing, because it's, regardless of the fact that it's private infrastructure needing public investment, it's an arrangement between the public and the private sector. And I think, getting a partnership together to properly scope a project is what gets these done. In the green space, discussion we just had, I think those are things that the public sector is supposed to do. Right? There are certain, I think, priorities that the public sector is supposed to take on, and find ways for the private sector to do other things that might free up dollars to provide more green space, for example. So I think it's sort of, from my perspective, I think it's really the same. So we're having the same conversation. It's just you're starting from the private side and saying, how do I get public infrastructure into this thing to get the whole thing going, as opposed to, okay, well, I'm a public sector entity. I want to generate, some private sector revenues for an incremental road or wastewater plant.
There's
This is on. Caitlin Durkovich from Toffler Associates. And I guess my question is, are we leveraging future value modeling, future value analysis to the extent that we can in a lot of these projects, in terms of both ensuring that we have these big, audacious 21st century goals for our infrastructure? So we're bringing together all of the stakeholders and understanding their desires, what they want in that future infrastructure, and that plays a little bit into, we don't know what the future is going to look like, but if you can bring stakeholders together and understand what's important to them, not just now, but 20 to 30 to 40 years down the road, that's the qualitative side, and that will drive some of your quantitative measures, which then kind of allows a framework for both the public sector but also the private sector to decide, not just in terms of the monetary return on investment, but future value of that infrastructure. Is this project going to deliver? Is this the bid that we want? Because it not only is putting the housing up, but it's got the green spaces and all the other things that we need. To what degree are we looking at these problems using future value analysis?
I can take some of a crack at it. I mean, I think, I guess to go back to the example of the toll road that's anticipating automation, I think it is in practice now. Again, I mean, difficult to have a crystal ball as to exactly what that'll all mean. One of the nuances that I will say, would in a concession contract that will help you get there is kind of the separation clause, right? So if a public authority lets out the concession, the concessionaire looks to have a return on their investment for taking a view on what the future may bring. So arguably, they're taking the majority of that upside and downside risk. In most good concessions, there's an option for the public authority to take it back, right? And as a private investor, what we would always suggest is the most equitable is to take a look at that investment, how it's been performing to date, and what that snap in time is looks like, right? So in other words, if you terminate after 5 years, 10 years, right, you may have a little bit better sense as to what's coming down the pike, and the compensation mechanism that needs to take that into account, right, and not look to pay back the investor just their initial investment, right, because that asset may have a lot more value. And at the same time, it wouldn't be unusual for a public authority to say, well, it is our asset. We're ultimately the owner. It's going to ultimately return back to us. So we'd like to have some of that upside as well. And so there's a little bit of a push and pull, and most good concession agreements have a mechanism so that both parties kind of, come out whole. And I think that kind of speaks to your question as to whether these future developments are taken into account, or at least allows them to be.
All right, we've got about 2 minutes left, so we got, Art, if you can ask a 1-minute question and somebody can give a 1-minute response,
I'm trying to make it real simple. If we've got 3 buckets for funding, one being state funding, one being federal, and one being private, I think we need to be cautious that we get real private money into the private bucket. Take a federal TIFIA loan, which comes from the Highway Trust Fund, and make that a loan to the private entity. It's not really private money, because that money could have been taken and sent directly out to the states to combine with that state money. So as we go towards a private model, it needs to be real private money, private activity bonds such as that, not taking some federal source that's already there and is not enough to meet what's there. And commend you, Representative Poole, for filing your gas tax in Alabama. I agree with you. It may not be the best model because it's declining, but it's what we got right now. And we've got to change. We're running out of time for blue ribbon panels to study what's next when the mileage-based user fee may be the next. In Texas, we already tell the state how many miles we drive. You go in to get your inspection, they plug your car in, you don't tell them, your car tells them how much. The challenge is, how do you turn that into a revenue source? But I think with the private source, there is a way to do it, but we need to make sure it is really private money, not taking government money, disguising it in some other wrapping, and give it to private by taking it away from some other source over here.
All right, with that, that's a good place to stop. I want to commend our panel and thank you, gentlemen. You are all part of the solution, as is everyone else here in this room. I think we ended up where we began to some degree, which is not a bad thing necessarily, and that is it's going to take every tool we've got to address this problem, and the best minds working on it. And I want to please join me in thanking this panel. All right. Yeah, hang on.
They're gonna mic you guys up here pretty quick. No, I'm not. I'm doing intro. Kylie Rent is the moderator.
One of the issues we studied is because we budget every 2 years here at Texas. And we don't know what that budget's going to look like from when we hire it. So I'm not sure we can even buy from ourselves.
Howdy and welcome back. If you take your seats, please. Howdy, my name is Bill Stockton. I'm with the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, and we appreciate your being here all day and certainly for this panel. Let me introduce our panel for this particular session. Our moderator is Kylie Wren. He's an industry fellow and executive director of the Office of Industry Relations for the Texas A&M Engineering Experiment Station. We call them TEAS on the logo up here, where he leads the efforts to develop business strategies and establish strategic relationships with industry. Prior to joining A&M, he was in senior leadership at KBR Wiley. He did R&D and business development. There he led the systems engineering and integration, helped establish and operate a $160 million per year human research program at NASA, led an agency-wide and multi-agency NASA innovation programs, and led other multi-million-dollar business development activities with private industry and NASA and other federal sectors. Dan Woodfin is the Senior Director of System Operations for Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. And he has responsibility for the 24/7 reliable operations of the electric power systems that serves about 90% of Texas, and includes ERCOT's real-time operations, operational planning, engineering, and support activities. He joined ERCOT in 2003 and served in various leadership roles, including Director of System Planning, prior to moving into his current position in 2012. Larry Brown is the adjunct professor at George Washington University Law School in Washington, D.C., where he teaches a course in atomic energy law. In addition to his full Navy career, he served the George W. Bush administration as a senior policy advisor for nuclear, spent fuel, non-proliferation, and nuclear security issues. And in both the Bush and Obama administrations, he was an appointee to the Nuclear Facilities Safety Board. Ron Hahn serves as Executive Vice President for Critical Infrastructure Protection Strategies at AECOM. And he's responsible for the development of the infrastructure strategies to include legislation, policy, and doctrine considerations, expert witness of current and future security landscape, critical technology concerns, security and protection solutions, and key industry, federal, and academia engagements. He developed and led the Department of Defense Electromagnetic Spectrum Vulnerabilities Assessment Team, responsible for evaluating U.S. DoD systems for potential vulnerabilities, ranging from electromagnetic interference to the use of advanced warfare threats. He served 20 years in the United States Marine Corps. Caitlin Durkovich is a director at Toffler Associates with expertise in critical infrastructure security and resilience, including cybersecurity. She has successfully advanced public-private partnerships that drive thought leadership, influence policy, and evolve industry practices to manage security and operational risks. Prior to being at Toffler, she served as Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection with the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama. She led the mission to protect critical infrastructure and redefined public-private risk management for emerging issues like complex mass attacks, electric grid security, cybersecurity, GPS resilience, and climate adaptation planning. It's almost as like the previous panel was a setup for this panel. So, Kylie, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. As you can see, we have a very distinguished panel here to close out the day. I'm not sure why everybody left, because this is clearly going to be the best panel of the day.
Traffic.
Yeah. So, but no, we've had some great panels today, and so we get the opportunity to kind of be the anchor leg and close out the day. So what we would like to do is kind of have our distinguished panelists help set the stage a little bit, but then we do want to get quite a bit of audience involvement. So please do come with your questions, and we'll try to give you ample opportunity to bring those. So to help set the stage, I'd like to start by allowing each of our panelists to offer your perspective on the challenges associated with energy infrastructure projects and programs. Please say a little bit about your particular background and expertise and the lens through which you look at this topic. Larry, would you start, please?
Thank you, and thank you for staying. From this angle with the lights here, we think the audience, all the seats are filled.
We were told they were not.
Again, my expertise is in nuclear energy, nuclear power. My focus is on domestic production of nuclear energy. It's a energy source at the crossroads, really. Unlike most of the day we talked about transportation issues, and which have potentially safety problems, safety issues with some bridges and some tunnels and some roads that really deserve a lot of attention for safety reasons. Nuclear is under an intense blanket of regulation, and safety, I don't believe, is an issue. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission manages every aspect of that. However, it has two significant issues. The aging infrastructure. There are 99 nuclear power plants supplying 20% of America's electricity today. Of those 99 plants, 45 of them are over 45 years old, over 40 years old, and their license is for a maximum of 60 years, so they're nearing retirement. Within the next 13 years, a third of those 99 plants are going to retire. That offers a significant challenge of replacement. Where will we get those plants? Now, why do we care? I would offer one aspect of nuclear energy that I think is lost in the mix all the time, and that is national security. In the last 20 years, the America's nuclear power plants consumed approximately 20,000 Russian nuclear weapons as fuel. There's no other reasonable way to get rid of those materials other than the use of nuclear power plants. In the future, we have agreements with Russia to destroy another 17 metric tons of nuclear materials. They'll destroy 17 if we destroy 17. It's a significant non-proliferation asset, and it doesn't get any credit for that, at least not in the public venue. But the other problem that nuclear energy has is, besides aging infrastructure, is the legacy issues that the government has simply failed to deliver upon. And so we are passing a huge legacy problem onto the future generations, and I'm talking about the disposal of spent nuclear fuel and radioactive waste. The government has failed, both the state governments and the federal government, to address what happens with spent nuclear fuel and with low-level radioactive waste. Texas is somewhat of an exception. They've stepped forward and are addressing an issue which most other states in the United States are simply turning a blind eye to, and continue to store medical waste and other radioactive waste that are of low intensity, but nonetheless they require storage and it costs money. The failure of the federal government to take on the issue of spent nuclear fuel cost you, the taxpayers, $20 billion over the last 10 years. Those are court settlements between the utilities and the federal government, where the federal government failed to live up to the contracts that they had with the utilities, and it'll cost you $500 million a year, every year, beginning in 2021 until such time as the federal government starts accepting the nuclear waste, which they are contracted to do. So it's a dollar issue, it's a legacy issue, it's an aging infrastructure issue. And for those that, I wanted to ask, how many here drive a plug-in vehicle? Not many. But if you drive a plug-in vehicle and your objective is to reduce your carbon footprint, you aren't being successful unless you're getting the electricity to charge your car from a renewable source, whether it's solar, wind, hydro, or nuclear. There's not a lot of solar at night when I charge my car, so fortunately I live in a county that has a nuclear power plant. But looking to the future, that's, I think, an important issue that nuclear can help address. And as Representative this morning talked about potential for desalination plants on the Texas coast and the need for them, he thought 3 would be helpful. How do you do that? It takes energy to do that. I don't think you want to burn petroleum to make water. So that's my issue. That's what I work on.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for that perspective. Caitlin?
Yes. Thank you, and it's wonderful to be here this afternoon. I appreciate being invited to be part of this and understand that we are standing in between you and getting on the roads and beating traffic, which is why I think the room has thinned out a little bit. But it has been really an extraordinary day, and I found myself in agreement with much of what has been said on the panels. I come at this largely from my previous position as Assistant Secretary of Infrastructure Protection at the Department of Homeland Security. And it is a mission that certainly evolved in the time that I held that position. And that is in part both because the department itself shifted from purely kind of an anti-terrorism focused department to one that was dealing with all hazards following Katrina. But also because of the recognition that at the end of the day, the stakeholders that we worked closely with, the owners and operators of critical infrastructure, and the important mission of minimizing disruptions to that infrastructure because of its importance to national security, economic prosperity, community resilience. We were seeing as many disruptions caused by natural and other events as we were events of terrorism. And so really at the onset of my tenure there, started to shift our focus both to all hazards, but looking more closely at lower probability, high consequence events, and what I would call kind of existential threats to our infrastructure. The way the partnership works at the Department of Homeland Security is that you have a sector-specific agency. That's a department that represents the particular sector. For the energy sector, it is the Department of Energy. We co-chair that effort. And then on the industry side, it brings representatives from industry to the table to talk about emerging threats and hazards, to develop plans and best practices about how to mitigate these threats and hazards. And by virtue of that, this was a little different in the electric industry than in some of the other critical infrastructure sectors. This was a sector that was represented by the CEOs of most of the electric-owned utilities, as well as the public power companies and the rural cooperatives. And it really gave us an interesting opportunity to work closely on some bigger strategic electric issues. In part, both cybersecurity, but as you started to think about the modernization of a grid that had largely been, or largely is reliable because of, in part, the commitment to it by industry, and also the patchwork nature of it, that we needed to really start to focus on how we were going to secure and ensure the grid for the 21st century, the security of the grid for the 21st century. And so I think the thing that strikes me most as we start to think about investing in energy infrastructure is the importance of understanding a couple of different things. One is that our adversaries understand the strategic importance of our infrastructure. They have done that for a very long time. And as much as we worry about physical threats to our infrastructure, we have certainly seen over the course of the last decade them gain footholds through the cyber threat vector. And there is no question that as we look to modernize the grid, that we become more reliant on telecommunications, on space infrastructure for grid efficiency, that we have to take all of this into account. I think the other key point that was raised by the woman here from SMU is that there is no critical infrastructure function that operates independently anymore, and that we are a highly connected, interdependent infrastructure. It is a complex ecosystem that merits consideration as we look to how we continue to modernize this. And we have to account for the fact, again, that much of these systems are dependent on our communications network, on transportation to a certain degree, on many other sectors. And so part of the conversation that needs to be had is how, in looking at a modern grid, do we make sure that we have all of the parties together? And I think that there are together at the table talking about the vision for a modern grid and all of the dependencies and what that means. I think that what I took away from my time at the department is that when you bring people together, and there are a number of authorities and ways to do this, leveraging the federal government and authorities that Congress has given it, that there can be a very productive conversation that looks out into the future and understands those future threats and hazards and is able to bring a collaborative approach to the table. And we've certainly seen that in the security and resilience realm. And I think that when you ask leaders of these industries really to come together and to recognize that if we don't work to modernize our infrastructure and do it in a way that is secure and resilient, it is going to represent an existential threat to our country. And so I think this is an important conversation that we have. We have to continue both to foot stomp it, but to elevate it into the C-suites and the senior leadership of both industry and government, because it is not only an economic question, but certainly a national security and a community resilience issue as well.
Excellent insight, Kayla.
I'd make 2 points. I think the first point is the fact that we really have to understand that when most of our infrastructure was built, it wasn't really built with resiliency in mind. So that's the first challenge. So we now have to look at it and say, we've got to take infrastructure, we've got to figure out how do we modernize it, how do we make it resilient. And I agree with Caitlin's comments. You really got to make it resilient against all hazards. And the fact is that it does. All the different sectors touch. So when you look at the grid and all the factors that are necessary to empower the grid, it goes well beyond power. So we've seen that certainly through the natural disasters that we face, not only through Hurricane Sandy, but we're seeing it now with both Harvey and Irma. The other thing I think is that we have to change our thinking when it comes to how we're going to design and implement infrastructure. That's really my challenge at AECOM. That's what we do. We design, we build, we construct infrastructure. And what I find is that we tend to think of the resiliency side kind of secondary. So we think about what we need to provide. And it doesn't matter whether we're building a water treatment plant, whether we're building a nuclear power plant, or whether we're working on the grid. We tend to think of what are the requirements necessary for that component. And then when we get through the design and we start in the construction, then somewhere down the line, somebody gives me a call and says, hey, how do we make this secure? How do we make this resilient? The challenge is that actually has to happen. That has to be the first part of the conversation. So part of what we have to do is we have to drive that conversation much, much earlier. The second thing is that we have to think of resiliency really I'm going to say in 3 buckets. The first bucket I think we hear about all the time, and that's cyber. I mean, it's about data, whether it's the grid, transportation, it's more and more about the data. We're instrumenting, we're sensing, we're gathering, we're producing more and more data. So the first part is we have to understand that logical component, that digital component. The second bucket is the physical side, right? The physical things that are going to be a result of that infrastructure that we do. And then the third bucket is the wireless of how we're going to move that data. By the way, we tend to, it's funny, we tend to forget about that third bucket a lot. That third bucket, by the way, is really important. And by the way, it's part of our, when you look at Spectrum, it's going to be one of our most valuable properties from an infrastructure standpoint. You go and talk to any major company, I do all the time when we're doing a security assessment, I can always find, the CISO that's got responsibility for the cyber side. I can always find the guy that's responsible for the physical side. I ask them what's their wireless security plan and how they manage that and their wireless networks, and they typically look at me and have no idea the number of wireless access points, how you do them, how you secure them. So we've got to pull those together. We can't look at it stovepipe, and I think that's the last challenge. Is when I go in, and we do a number of assessments. We do them for major providers of public transportation. We look at all components, positive rail control, lots of things that are going on. And that's where we find the gaps. We find the gaps, and if you look at what our adversaries and how our adversaries are attacking us in their space, they're leveraging those gaps. So, we've got to change our perception. We can't operate in stovepipes. We've got to, in essence, collaborate together to steal kind of what Caitlin said earlier. I think you got to pull the experts together. The challenge is you got to pull them together, and we got to pull them together much earlier in the process, and then we've got to expand that thinking. Because, again, I agree with her, it really does have to be an all hazards approach. And then the last thing I would say is I think when we have an event, any type of event, and I look at the most recent with both Harvey and Irma, I really wonder as and my company's been, we're heavily involved already in maintaining and restoring water treatment and providing. But when those events happen, I wonder what our adversaries are doing. And I wonder if they're looking at the opportunities and seeing, because in the haste to get things back up and operational, those vulnerabilities and those things that make them resilient, those kind of fall by the wayside, right? Because we got to get up and running, we got to get things fixed. So I always worry when we have these events to go back and say, we almost need to follow up and make sure this is when we need to be, in essence, most critical and most concerned, because in our haste, our adversaries are always looking for those opportunities. So again, I think those are the things I look at earlier in the planning, really in the conceptual. Don't wait till we get into the physical construction side. And then what we call converged resilience, look at those buckets together, bring that collaboration together, and then you've got to apply it across all hazards.
Dan?
So I guess, especially to a crowd like I've gathered that this is where you're mostly transportation professionals, it's probably good before we start talking too much about what needs to change to understand how things work today in the electric power business particularly. So I want to kind of give an overview of that. The power grid in the eastern United States, kind of east of the Rocky Mountains, is all interconnected together. West of the Rocky Mountains and the Canadian provinces are all interconnected together. Texas grid is different. It's different in several ways, but one of the ways it's different is that it's not electrically connected to the rest of the United States. We have a few small ties a couple of small ties to the eastern U.S., 3 ties with Mexico. So it's kind of an independent grid that's responsible for balancing generation and load, that load being the electrical power that consumers consume. That's all has to be produced within the state, so we're kind of a standalone island where we make our ways ourselves. So the company I work for is responsible for that. We're responsible for maintaining that balance between generation and load within the state. And we actually serve 90% of that load. There's portions of the Panhandle area, portions of East Texas and El Paso that aren't part of that electrical grid. So that's part of the understanding. The second thing that's different about the Texas grid, and I want to contrast that with the rest of the U.S., is that in Texas we've had significant amount of deregulation that occurred in the 2001 timeframe. And because of that deregulation, the generation business is considered to be a competitive product. The retail provision of power is a competitive service as well. So it's really the wires, the big transmission lines, and then the distribution lines, which are the smaller lines that go around your neighborhood and hook up to the green box in your yard or the pole behind your house. Those are still owned by regulated utilities. But the generation piece is those investment decisions in new generators, retirement decisions for generators are made by the companies, for-profit companies that own those generators, and they're making those decisions to invest in a new generator, the type of generator they're going to invest in, and so forth, based on traditional, just like any other private company. They're going to make, are they making money or not? On the retail side, that piece, who serves you at your house, unless you're in one of the municipal-owned utilities or the cooperative areas, if you're in the rest of the state that were previously served by the investor-owned utilities, then you have the right to choose who your retail provider is, and you're not getting the provision of service, that electrical power, from the company that owns the wires hooked up to your house. So that's kind of the framework in Texas. In the rest of the U.S., for the most part, you still have vertically integrated utilities that own the generation, they own the wires to get the generation to your house, and they're the only company that will sell you, that can sell you the retail power at your house. So they're vertically integrated utilities. And then in the Northeast and kind of the Midwest and central part of the U.S., there's also a wholesale market kind of overlay that allows those generators to compete against each other in a wholesale market. There's not, and California has one of those as well. The rest of the West and the Southeast part of the U.S. don't have even those kind of markets. There's trading that goes on bilaterally, but there's not kind of an established wholesale market like what ERCOT provides. And so with that in mind, there's kind of a different regime. The ERCOT ISO, my company, was set up to really make it work in Texas, pull those pieces together, because it's still one big system that has to operate from generation all the way to the provision of the low generation to the electricity consumers. And so somebody had to make all that work together, make the wholesale market work, make the retail market work, do the planning of the transmission network to make sure that it stays reliable and efficient. So that's really our responsibility here. In the rest of the U.S., there's not such a clear entity that does that. Now, in the areas that there are markets, those markets do that, but the vertically integrated utilities have that role within those regions that are only served by those integrated utilities. So I thought it'd be interesting and helpful to provide that kind of background as a lead-in.
Yeah, very good. Appreciate that insight, Dan. So as we're thinking about these challenges, we heard about threats to national security. We heard about the maybe lack of early establishment of resiliency factors in design and that sort of thing. Let's move on to some concrete examples of how to maybe address some of those obstacles. Let's try to put some things on the table that get at what would be good steps to provide in terms of feedback from this caucus of what are some next steps that could happen to maybe begin the early road of correction in some of these items. Anybody want to take a stab, first of all, at that?
I'm happy to start with that question. So I thought about an interesting case study that I saw. The department was invited to go down to Charleston, which is dealing with a very serious issue of sea level rise. And they're seeing a lot of flooding, both in the city itself, but in the neighboring communities around it. And it's starting, it has impacted business and the overall economy, and they're taking aggressive steps to deal with it. And we went down there and co-hosted an exercise with the College of Charleston to talk about some of the data that was available related to sea level and how you might bring the community together to start to deal with that as it started thinking about kind of long-term planning efforts. And as an aside, when you go down and you do these visits as a government official, you get to go visit some pretty neat infrastructure along the way. And one of the places that we visit is that Boeing had put its massive Dreamliner plant just outside of Charleston. Entirely new, beautiful, massive facility. They obviously did a lot of research about where they were going to put that plant. The one thing that they didn't take into account is the fact that Charleston is a area that is prone to floods, and that it is now sitting along a coast that is dealing with rapidly rising seas. And so when they opened the plant, it was dealing with flooding, and then when all the massive rains came through in 2015, it saw some flooding, and workers had a difficult time getting to the plant because the roads and the networks were flooded. And I thought that it was very instructive about, here's a Fortune 500 company that has all the resources available to them when they do their due diligence about where they're going to place a major plant. And they didn't make use of all the available data. And that does have to account for not only climate data, but I think as we're seeing in Irma and Harvey, is that I think we do a good job planning for the last storm or the last event. What we have to start to do is plan for that 1 in 1,000 year or that 1 in 500 year event. And it is going to be costly. And I've heard this a couple of times over the course of the last 24 hours, is that the cost efficient, the cheap projects. I think we have to stop looking at projects from the cheapest, and we have to really look at, all right, what's going to bring the most value, what's going to solve both short but also long-term issues. It's a long way of saying at the end of the conclusion of this exercise, what came out of it is something called the Charleston Resilience Network, which is both provides a forum to create a long-term vision for urban planning in Charleston, but a way to bring together data and analysis and make it available to all parties who are involved in the planning of the city of Charleston. And that's not just the state and the local government, but also the electric utilities, the ports, a lot of the private sector companies that are in the state of Charleston. And so it's making this data available to the companies themselves, but it's created this network, this forum of people who have a vested interest in the long-term sustainability and economic health of the city, and is really, at the end of the day, driven really a new framework and a set of tools that is allowing stakeholders and constituents that didn't normally come together to come together and think about these things in a collaborative, coordinated, and strategic fashion.
So there's that collaboration piece and maybe that shared vision piece that we heard about this morning coming together as well. Anybody else want to?
Yeah, I think something we're doing, I think this is interesting. It goes back, kind of, Caitlin, to your comment about different sectors and how they work together. And we're working on a concept where we're basically bringing modular data capability to the utilities and providing it, where power and typically fiber already exists. So it does a couple of things. One, it's a tremendous asset from a resiliency standpoint, right? Since the fact that when you have an event, you're not having to go external. You can actually, whether you keep your primary data there or whether you keep backup data there, it adds considerable resilience to the grid. The second thing it does, and really the interesting thing is it opens up the second avenue potentially for revenue, as well as being able to distribute data closer to the edge. I think as we see, this room is full of transportation experts, and I think as you look at, I think most of us in some form know that some variation of autonomous vehicles is certainly coming. The key to that success will be, how do we manage the data? Right? How do we secure the data and the reliability of that data? And that data is consistently moving further and further to the edge, closer and closer to the user. And so this concept of utility data stations, I think, is very interesting because it kind of adds several components. It moves data closer to the edge, And so it solves some of the challenges that you have with our data and our data flow. It adds resiliency into the utilities. And then, kind of the unique perspective is it adds and opens up additional revenue streams into the utilities that weren't otherwise there. So I think it's those types of answers and those types of thinking about a problem, bringing different technologies into a sector that you might not necessarily correlate a utility and a data provider, and how those two actually work really well together, right? I mean, you think about the number one cost of a data center, it's bringing the power, right? Why not bring the data station to where the power already exists? So I just thought.
Very good. Anybody else? Dan, Larry?
Well, I guess I almost question the premise of the statement because I think it's different. The answer differs depending on where you're talking about. I mean, what we've seen in Texas is that from a power system perspective, if you look, since the market was deregulated, that's market structure has added roughly 30 gigawatts of new gas generation in the area. We've added 20 gigawatts of wind generation in the area, and we had a retirement of roughly 15 gigawatts of old, inefficient steam generation. And so we've had a pretty tremendous turnover of generation resources. You haven't necessarily seen that in the other parts of the U.S., some more recently where you've had more older units that are retiring, but you haven't seen it as much in all of those areas. We've also, Texas has built about $15 billion in new transmission lines over the last 10 years, which is a pretty tremendous investment. So some of the barriers that we were talking about, haven't the regulatory regime and the regulatory structure within Texas has encouraged things that maybe haven't been encouraged elsewhere in the U.S. There's clouds on the horizon to some extent with low natural gas prices. That drives lower wholesale market prices that generators get, and so then there's not as much incentive to invest, and so that's across the U.S. as a whole. That's a concern because really those low natural gas prices are driving less investment in those places that there are markets. But in general, Texas has been much better off. So the question really is, how do you encourage those things in the other parts of the U.S. that we've been able to do here?
Yeah, it sounds like there's something to be had there to hold Texas maybe as a model. Yes. In some cases, to be able to enlighten the other markets, from that particular sector. Very good.
Part of the challenge is these wholesale market prices and affecting the rest of the country, at least that portion. I look at the nation as either the regulated utilities and the unregulated or merchant utilities, and it's basically about half nuclear power plants are in the regulated utilities, and I look at that as the southeast, and about half are in the merchant market. Now, in the merchant market, primarily because of natural gas prices, which have surprised a lot of us that were in DOE a decade ago, the wholesale price of kilowatt hour of electricity has dropped from $90 to $36. Now, if you're planning on operating a nuclear power plant and you need $36 a kilowatt hour just to break even, you're on the verge of deciding whether you're going out of business or you're going to stay in business. Now, this is directly affect two examples in Illinois and in New York, where the utility has said, we can't make it. Give us some help, state, or we're out of here. And in the state of Illinois, they just passed a bill to give the utility $235 million a year for the next 2 years to help keep from those plants shutting down. That's saving 4,200 jobs in Illinois. In the state of New York, they're doing a similar thing. They have their favorites and they have their unfavorites. Indian Point is down New York City, and the governor doesn't like Indian Point. But the other 3 nuclear power plants are in remote areas where employment is critical. And the New York State Power Plan to reduce the carbon footprint of the state needs those plants to meet their goals. And so the state of New York has forked over $500 million a year for the next 2 years to keep those plants open. So it takes, in the market economy, the merchant economy, we were talking earlier about transportation, and you need a funding stream to make the improvements to your roads, bridges, and other things. And do we raise taxes, or how do we do it? Well, if you're private sector operating a nuclear power plant or any power plant, you need a funding stream. You need to have some reasonable assurance that you're going to make a profit. Because if you don't, your investors are going to throw the bums out, you know, to get a new board of directors. So it's I would say the whole market unregulated system maybe needs somewhat of a look to try and assess where it's going. If we're going to have electric vehicles, if Elon Musk is going to have his magnetic tube between Washington, D.C. and New York, it's going to be a lot of power that's required to do those things, and where's it going to come from?
I think I'd like to pause there and go to the audience and see if we have generated some questions. Yeah, it looks like we have. Back.
I had one question on the resiliency question. What is I've read many things about the vulnerability of our grid to an EMP attack. If we are vulnerable to that, is there anything that will be done, to y'all's knowledge, in the future to address that possible vulnerability?
I'm happy to take that. That's a good question, and this goes to the kind of overall approach to critical infrastructure security and resilience, which is, you know, risk management at the end of the day. And when you look at the threat matrix, I would put EMP, a high altitude EMP, kind of low probability, certainly high consequence. You know, there are things that are happening in the national security realm that, you know, would concern me more now than maybe in the past, but it is still pretty low, low probability. The good thing is that there are measures that I think this is what is great about the public-private partnership, is that it is certainly an area where utilities have made investments in hardening the infrastructure to also space weather, which is equally as much of a concern, and we're long overdue for a pretty significant space weather event here, and some of the inroads that we've made in terms of forecasting and hardening the grid for that would pay benefits down the road. But the Electric Power Research Institute is in the process of, I think, finishing the second part of a study that will lend itself to help us better understand what measures are going to go the furthest in terms of mitigating any type of attack like that. I think the industry is very weary of spending any money on that because we don't yet have the data and the analysis that we need from EPRI really to understand where we're going to get the most return on investment. But this is kind of one of these issues that certain, former officials in the national security space like to hype a lot. This is now Caitlin speaking. And there are a number of other, I would say, more prescient threats and hazards that we need to be dealing with, and that the industry really is dealing with at the end of the day. You want to add anything?
I love to talk EMP, so it's kind of my background and my specialty. I used to run the Joint Electronic Warfare Center. It's interesting. I sat on the Defense Science Board a couple years ago. We did a summer study on 21st century military operations in a complex electromagnetic environment. EMP came up, and I was really disappointed because we kind of punted it just because of the complexity of EMP. And we didn't take the approach of it from an infrastructure grid side. We took it more from a mission assurance side on the DoD side. So I think I would say two things. I would completely agree. I think it's a low probability event, but a high consequence event. And given the challenges and the costs of EMP hardening, really makes it, when you put it in that, and I agree with Caitlin, when you kind of look at, it's about the ROI, right? And as you manage risk and you look at it and you go, I've got limited resources to spend, I would agree. I think there's other threats that probably are a higher probability with similar higher consequence that probably drive funding. I do think we need to continue to look at, and I think we need to consider that as we invest in future capabilities of and take EMP into account. But I think that's a challenge, and it's so complex that we tend to kind of it either goes in one direction. We either hype it up as this, the ultimate weapon, or we tend to just that's too challenging.
Later.
Ignore it. Dan, were you going to add?
No, I just think I'm glad Caitlin brought up the EPRI study, because I think that's really the thing that's going to answer a lot of the questions related to how big of a risk is it, what can you do kind of as you're constructing new substations and those kind of things to do it mitigate the risk in an appropriate way.
I think was there a follow-up question back there, or no? Okay, we got one here.
Mr. Brown, you were talking about, well, actually, a couple of you have talked about market forces driving alternative fuel sources out of the market, essentially, that the plants are shutting down that use certain kinds of energy production. And you mentioned that the state stepped in to save jobs, but it seems like there's a pretty clear national security implication of allowing alternative fuel production facilities to go out of business completely. Is there a national discussion going on about trying to maintain some amount of flexibility in fuel sources that are driving our electric generation?
There's some debate going on. Congress, I think, there's bipartisan support for maintaining the nuclear end of the business, electric production, and that's manifested with production tax credits that new power plants can be eligible for, and loan guarantees that new power plants can be eligible for. And in Congress right now, they're debating extending those, the time limits on availability for those. That's new plants. Efforts to protect the existing fleet, at least through the end of the license period, I'm not aware of much going on at the national level. The market is so diverse. You've got the unregulated and the regulated markets, and in the regulated markets, they seem to do much better, not only in maintaining their the price, the wholesale prices that support the plants, but also in those markets, they are capable of making investments in new supply. So that's the two markets where there are nuclear power plants being built are South Carolina and Georgia, and the local Public Service Commission has ponied up some money to help progress those projects. But in the unregulated markets, the merchant markets, there really isn't much appetite for the risk. It takes 10 years from the time you say, hey, I think I'd like a new power plant in College Station. Well, to go through the planning, the regulatory, the environment, and the construction, you're talking 10 years easily. And that's a long time to predict what the market is going to be like and put a $10 billion investment and ask the investors to say, just hold on, you'll get your money here in 10 years. So maintaining the fleet is, there's discussions on what could be done, but I'm not aware of any specific ideas. Last week, the senator from New Mexico and Michigan, I believe, put in a bill to increase the rebate on carbon capture. Apparently, today, if you are a utility, a coal-fired or I guess natural gas-fired utility, if you capture a ton of CO2 and give it to the petroleum industry, which they use to pump oil with, or you sequester it somehow, you get $25 for every ton that you do. I would like to see them say, all right, well, if you don't produce CO2, for every ton you don't produce, which is easily calculable, you also get some sort of credit to help level the playing field. Where is it that you actually get paid for producing a gas that everybody doesn't like? It's kind of a big deal. But anyway.
Very interesting. Good questions. We have one in the front, and then we've got one in the back also.
Yeah, this is a question really for ERCOT. Fantastic story about deregulation and the impact that it's had on Texas. What are the lessons learned as we kind of think about the fact that, we've got power and grid modernization taking place that has to improve the reliability of IT and data processing and data centers? What are the lessons that we can take forward out of what has happened here in Texas that we can take to other parts of the country as we think about aging infrastructure that has to be modernized, and the fact that as we look into the future, we're moving in an environment where everything is going to require compute storage and networking capability that's based on highly reliable power.
So I guess there's lots of questions baked into that question. I mean, one of the reasons that I guess in terms of the change out in efficient generation from less efficient generation is that markets tend to drive to the most efficient point. So that's one lesson learned. So in that way, that has caused some of it. So the places that you have markets, you tend to drive toward more efficiency, even outside of Texas. The second thing is from a transmission perspective, what gets in the way of building transmission sometimes outside of Texas is that you don't have one regulatory entity across the whole length of the line. If you're trying to build a new transmission line from point A to point B, state A to state B, but there's state C in the middle, this entity may get some economic development benefit from new generation being built. This state may get the cheaper power because it winds up there. The guy in the middle doesn't get anything except a transmission line running across, and so there's some regulatory incentives there that planning across a broader area is better. And then from a kind of a technology, and as we move more toward distributed generation and those kind of things, I think something that's going to be important is that the power system is so important that the way it's designed today, it tends to fail to a safe place. So when communication systems and those kind of things fail, we have ways of operating the system in such a way that they kind of are failing to a safe way where we can actually still operate the system. As we get more and more technology baked into that, more controls at the distributed level, I think that's something we need to try to preserve, is that failing to a safe place in the development of those things.
Excellent question. There was one in the back, yeah.
I have a two-part question. One is car manufacturers are aggressively planning to move towards electric vehicles. What is this going to do to electricity demand in terms of, if you move to, instead of using fossil fuels? Our second question is, if we see a story about data breaches every day, Experian today, something. And there is widespread stories that most of our grid operators are already penetrated by Russians and Chinese. And what is the policy mechanisms to make sure that there's some consequences for security breaches? If there's no cost to my security breach for me, I'm going to continue operating without doing much.
I'm happy to start with the second one,
Okay,
and
good.
then
Perfect.
you can follow on and take the first one too. I would say that grid operators take cybersecurity very seriously, and that's part of what I was alluding to kind of early in my remarks. This is an issue that government has been engaging with them on since certainly the start of the Obama administration, and I think what's really, when you kind of hold up the value of the public-private partnership, one of the more memorable, moments that I certainly had in my career there is that we took advantage of a meeting of all the investor-owns in Colorado Springs, and we brought the CEOs and the senior executives of all of these investor-owned utilities into a classified space and gave them a, what I call the super secret scary briefing about what was happening in cyberspace. And that was in 2011, and I think really laid the foundation for a very robust dialogue about what they were doing related to cybersecurity. And everyone in that room, left with, I think, an urgency in getting to know their CSO, their CISO. They wanted questions to ask. They wanted to, what can I do to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing? We've worked, or the department worked with the Department of Energy, to develop some very basic cyber hygiene standards that if you do most of these cyber hygiene things, and it's everything from multi-factor authentication to whitelisting to segmenting your networks, the list goes down, you're going to prevent 80% of cyber attacks. Now, there are, people sitting on those networks that have probably been there for a while, before there was good cyber hygiene, and that is recognized, and I think it's why it's important that we are having this conversation and that companies are taking this seriously and doing what they can to make sure that they have secure and resilient systems. I would argue to you that there is always a cost if you have a breach. And if you look at what happened to Equifax, and we can go down the long line of people, of companies that have been in the news, and the damage to your brand, the impact to your operations, the loss of customers. That's a little bit different for electric utility because sometimes they're the only game in town. You're going to have executives who lose their job, and it has become a boardroom issue, really, at the end of the day. And in certain sectors, the heavily regulated ones, in fact, it's become, it is part of the board culture and the board, what happens on the board. So there is a consequence, even if you have bad cyber hygiene. And so I don't think that you walk away without a cost. But it is a very serious issue, and we see what happens when you use cyber, vectors to perpetrate an attack. It happened in the Ukraine in December of 2015, using legitimate credentials, and somebody got into the system and was able to manipulate it and start to shut things down. This is where having some of an antiquated network was helpful. They also, by the way, did a telephone denial of service attack, talking about kind of the intersection of these things. So it made it difficult for customers to call in. They couldn't communicate with people down the line, but they were able to get into their trucks and go deal with the situation. As you engineer out the human element and everything becomes digitized, that's a much harder thing to do. And that's a conversation that we have to have in this rush to modernize and digitize and electrify. We can't engineer out the human element in all of this. So, my main argument is there has been an effort, a long-standing effort to raise cyber hygiene standards. The industry takes it very seriously, and there is a cost to every cyber breach. What you want to do is you want to mitigate it at the end of the day.
Yeah, so I guess one thing I'd add is that there is an organization called the North American Electric Reliability Council that promulgates standards for electric reliability in general. And they also have the standards that she mentioned are through that organization. They're mandatory reliability standards overseen by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And I would say that the bulk of the changes to those standards over the last several years have all been focused on, on cybersecurity and physical security. There's in fact been changes faster than some of the other standards are. So we all take that very seriously. The fines for not doing those, in addition to just reputational risk and CEOs getting fired and those kind of things, are $1 million a day per occurrence. So they're pretty significant. On the electric vehicle question, I think that part of it depends when those vehicles are charging. It depends when they're perhaps injecting back into the grid and those kind of things. And I guess I'm going to be the pro-market guy, because if you're getting the right price signals at your house or at your place of business as to what the cost of charging that vehicle is, then you're going to make the right decision yourself on when it's appropriate to charge it. If you're getting nights and weekends free or something like that, you're going to charge it at night. And the reason nights and weekends are free is because that's the cost of providing the power at that point in time. And you're not going to charge it during the afternoon when prices are, $100 a megawatt hour or something like that. So hopefully just getting those right market signals down to the retail level is going to be important.
Excellent. Good questions. Thank you, Dr. Eddy. Other question?
It's somewhat, I won't be lengthy, but long story short, in China, electric vehicles are on AC power. In this country, they're on DC power. So there's an ability for the inverter to power the vehicle, but there's no ability on the back end to get the power back out. So a lot of the discussion is electric vehicles will be energy storage devices that can repower the grid during high peak demand periods. But if there's no strategy on the back end to get that power back out of the vehicles, it's a tautological discussion. Is there any overarching discussion about the technologies that our electric manufacturers can and should be using so that we don't get ourselves in a bind and fall farther behind where the rest of the world is?
So you want to jump in on that one?
There's certainly a lot of activity, particularly at Tesla, to come up with better, larger, more capable storage capacity for electricity, which will benefit solar and wind, because obviously solar, you don't get enough moonlight at night to make a difference, and the wind off is, what, 33% of the time, something like that, that you get energy from those sources. So we need electricity storage capacity, and I understand Tesla's has a secret plant up near Las Vegas that they're going to generate some magic out of. But there are others. I've been to a number of conferences where they're they're studying different kinds of storage capacities for electricity, different kinds of batteries than, lithium ion, I think, is the most prominent today. They're looking at other technologies and other ideas. As far as getting the DC back out of my car, I don't have a converter, but I do on my boat. It takes, I can operate my microwave oven on the boat from the DC battery, so I don't think it's a real difficult problem going AC to DC, DC to AC much anymore.
The only thing I'd say, I do think renewable storage is a big issue, and it's a big challenge on the federal government side too. So I think, it's one of the things that we're looking at on the UDS concept of making that, in essence, a mechanism for renewable storage. So, that would make sense from, depending on, when this transformation occurs to electric vehicles and what the battery technology looks like at that time. I certainly could see that, but again, I'd agree, I hadn't thought of that, of pumping it back. It's an interesting concept of being able to put, we've thought about it on the UDS side, we haven't thought about it on the vehicle side. So be interesting to see what Tesla's thinking on that. I imagine that's not very challenging to solve that problem from a technical standpoint.
I mean, generally, the cost of solar installations are coming down, the cost of inverters are coming down because of that and continue to drop. And so I would think that that inverter technology price is going to, from a process perspective, that's kind of would be an individual investment decision, I guess.
Good question. Any other questions in the audience? We have time for another question. We've got a couple over there. We'll try to get them both in.
What I noticed from the morning is that a lot of our approach to transportation issues is they're all reactive rather than proactive. We're waiting for something to happen before we start, pumping money into it and solving the problem or throwing money at the problem. I know Larry mentioned that in 3 years we already know that there's going to be massive amounts of nuclear waste that we're going to be transporting. And one of the ways to transport it is through rail. Basically freight transportation, and the funding for freight transportation is on the decline. And we know that, for example, our condition monitoring and infrastructure is still in the 20th century. When are we going? At what point do you think we should start investing in taking the condition monitoring and the freight rail, getting it ready from the 20th to the 21st century to be able to address some of the issues that we know are coming?
Makes me think of a quote from a famous physicist. He said, predictions are difficult, particularly about the future. I think what drives most solutions, particularly costly solutions, is accidents or public fear. And so until there's some driving force that pushes the public to want to pay for these things, I think it's going to be difficult to get them to invest in freight rail, for example, or safety measures for freight rail. But on the other hand, public education is a powerful tool. I'm not sure we use it well enough. But if the public understood, to stick with my nuclear waste problem, that they were paying $500 million a year just going down the tubes. It's wasted money because it's not accomplishing anything. It's just storing the stuff in place. If they understood that if they got on with the job of disposal, that they could do away with that. And I'll just throw this out, by the way, we lost $750 million a year going into the nuclear waste fund a couple of years ago because the courts ruled that the administration had no plan for what they were going to do with the stuff, so therefore they couldn't collect the nuclear waste fund from the utilities, so that $750 million for the past 3 years that hasn't gone. So there's money to be captured there, and if the public understood what could be achieved if we got on with the job as opposed to just kicking the can down the road, maybe we could generate some interest.
I want to pick up on that idea because I think you're absolutely spot on, and it's been raised earlier in the conversation today. One is that we have an infrastructure that for the last 100 years has been incredibly reliable, and we do take it for granted. I mean, from everything from waking up in the morning, the fact that the power works and there's hot water and you go downstairs and you got gas and you can do your online banking and you get in the car and yeah, there's traffic, but you can get to work. And we just take it for granted until it's not there. And it's been fascinating to see people in Florida who are upset because they don't have power within 3 or 4 hours. Like we've created an expectation that it's always going to be there. And I think two thoughts here. One is that we do need a massive public service campaign about the importance of infrastructure and how it is what made this country great again when we were coming out of the Depression. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt had the vision and the strength and the energy to push, 15 major public work bills through Congress that drove, transformed how we did energy productions, built airports, built roads. I mean, it was remarkable what he did, and really brought America into the 21st century. And we need leadership, and we need a message in buying people into why this is important. Not just, for their own convenience, but because it underpins our society and it's important for our economy. Specific to projects themselves, I mean, I think we've seen this in the district with DC Water. We have this amazing visionary leader in the form of somebody named George Hawkins. And he runs our water and wastewater system in the district. And he's a guy, he's like a Princeton educated guy who runs around in the brown khaki shirt with like DC Water patches all over and rides in a truck and is just this very personable, wonderful guy who's really kind of transformed our water and wastewater system. And one of the major projects that he's undertaken is modernizing our storm runoff system. So, because it was built 100 years ago and it's a mess, and you got all sorts of stuff pouring into the Potomac and the Anacostia, so much so that no one would swim, much less you get worried about if you are on a boat in those rivers. And so, what he's doing through a series of projects, the first which is supposed to come online, I think, next year, his vision, the way he markets it, is that in 2025. You're going to be able to swim in the Potomac and the Anacostia, which was unimaginable, 5 years ago. And I think it's a $300 million, I can't quite remember what the figure is. Then he's done some green bonds, but you've also seen kind of an uptick in your water bill. And you know what? I'm okay with that. If it means that if my kids, if they're living in the district 10 years from now and they can go swim in the Anacostia and the Potomac, it's worth that extra 50 cents or whatever it is that's going into my bill. But it's been a brilliant public relations campaign. The Washington Post has written about it. It's on the radio. Pepco's done something similar in terms of their investments in the electric, in the power grid in the DC area after the derecho storms that took power out for 5 days. And they did a massive public service campaign about, both the investments that they're making in burying lines and cutting trees and how their EOC works. And when you start to tell people what you're spending their money on and why and what it's going to buy them and how it's going to improve their lives, you know what? They'll support you. And we just have to do a better job at it.
I'd just like to add one thought. I think it's a great question. And I think I look at, and I sit on a number of these panels throughout on different things with infrastructure. And the one thing that I think we sometimes forget is, we tend to build for yesterday and not for tomorrow. And we tend to think in how we think and how we grew up because we're in the senior positions, right? I mean, if I looked across this room, probably the median age, the first number is probably, if it's not a 5, it's a high 4, right? And if you look at particularly what I'm seeing in millennials, they act very different. And the demands of what they're going to have in the future, particularly transportation, are going to be very different. And I think that's going to drive, and we have to think about what the market's going to look like from a transportation side, of what they're going to demand. I think particularly when you look at autonomous vehicles and how the technology is here today. I mean, we have it today. The issue is how we can implement the technology and provide the infrastructure to make that work. But they don't want to own anything. One of the most compelling statistics I heard is the utilization rate on the average home vehicle. The utilization rate is 8%. If you think about your car and the time you're actually using your car, 92% of the time it's doing absolutely nothing for you. So if you think of that in any other kind of model or business model, you would never buy a service that 92% of the time you don't utilize. You just wouldn't do it, right? But yet we do it because of a culture that we've grown up in. I think the next culture, the next generation is not going to view it that way. they're gonna subscribe to a service that's gonna come pick them up and take them where they need to go when they need to go. That's why we've seen the rise of Uber. So the only thing I would say is I think we do have to kind of look out, see where the market's going, right? Because nothing's worse than designing, new roads and building a lot of rest stops that in 5 years there's no need for them because everything's autonomous. And rest stops would be a waste of time and money. And so you invest in something that the market's clearly not going in that direction. So.
Well, our time has come to an end. Very provocative questions and very insightful answers. Please help me thank our distinguished panelists for giving us their time.
All right, we're just going to ask the panelists just to hold in place as we celebrate what we've done here today and reflect on the many great conversations, discussions, and ideas that have been shared. So first, let me say thank you to you all for coming to join us here at Texas A&M and help us get this discourse and this dialogue started. So a round of applause for yourselves, please. And just briefly before we close, I would say that certainly, a lot of the discussion has been transportation focused. I think part of that is because if you listen on Capitol Hill, what do they talk about? Roads and bridges, roads and bridges. So there is a transportation overlay to this, but we certainly understand and respect the fact that infrastructure is much broader than that. And this conversation needs to continue. So on that point, I would certainly commend PPD 21, that's Presidential Policy Directive 21. Many of you are familiar with that document, but it's been republished in July of 2017, and it has 16 critical infrastructure sectors whose assets, systems, and networks, whether physical or virtual, are considered so vital to the United States that their incapacitation or destruction would have a debilitating effect on security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination thereof. And those 16 critical infrastructure categories, as my friend and colleague, Ms. Durkovich, is certainly personally familiar with, are chemical, commercial facilities, meaning malls and places where folks gather and share commerce, communications, critical manufacturing, dams, defense industrial base, emergency services, energy, as we're talking about here, financial services, food and agriculture, government facilities, healthcare and public health, information technology, nuclear reactors, materials and waste, transportation, one of the 16, and wastewater, water and wastewater treatments and systems. So all of these categories are critically important to our nation as we move forward through the 21st century. I'd also like to double down on one point that Chairman Schuster made, where he encouraged you to get engaged with your legislators, particularly your federal legislators. That is an absolutely critical point because one of the measures that they use in Washington is for every constituent who calls, they assume there are 500 more that have the same concern that didn't make the call. So every call matters, every call even grows exponentially their understanding of the issues that are important to the constituents. So thank you for that. So final thank yous. I'd certainly like to thank our sponsors of the symposium, and that's HNTB and Econolite. I certainly like to thank our symposium planning partners. And first and foremost, we have to give credit to helping us move this enterprise forward to Chancellor John Sharp and Associate Vice Chancellor and good friend John Barton at the Texas A&M University System. I'd certainly like to thank Dr. Kathy Banks, who had been here for most of the day with us, who's the Vice Chancellor and Dean of Engineering and the College of Engineering and Texas A&M Engineering Experiment Station. Also like to give thanks to Gary Serra, Director of the Texas A&M Engineering Extension Service, that's TEEX for those who went on the bus tour, and the staff at the Disaster City and the Brayton Fire Field. And certainly our partners here at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Certainly like to thank our elected officials, federal, state, and local officials who attended, State Representative Kyle Casal for hosting us at his ranch, Tonkaway Ranch, for the steak dinner last night. Hopefully that was certainly a Texas welcome and something that's memorable to all our Trump administration officials from USDOT, certainly our speakers, moderators, introducers, and the rapporteurs who will be creating the record of the conversations that we had here. Keep an eye out. We will be sending the draft report for all who attended to provide further comment and commentary. And a special thank you to the members of the TTI Events Management Team who have been here helping us throughout the day. And a big shout out to Aggie alum Michael Plank, who was a critical factor in working with us and get Chairman Schuster here, and certainly Chairman Bill Schuster, who was our keynote and the inspiration for this day. So again, the conversation will continue. The conversation will move forward. It's been a full day. It's been a busy day. I do not plan on keeping us till 5 for those who need to get moving. So again, thank you very much for joining us here in College Station. Travel safely, get home safely, and we look forward to working with you going forward. Thank you. Thank you, panel.